leave a message after the tone.
Riddick, it's Ben. I'm staring at the pro forma for the Glades project, and look, the math is completely broken. Without the REAP grant, without that USDA guarantee, I'm dead in the water. I don't get it. We were clipping along for 10 years, and now? It's like they turned the faucet off overnight. I keep hearing all about rural revitalization, onshoring, reshoring. I gotta be honest, Riddick. For a guy holding 5 solar permits, all this reshoring isn't exactly reassuring. You gotta walk me through this. Why is the USDA walking away from us? Call me.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pick Up. My name is JJ Kaye. I'm the CMO here at Capital Bank. Pick Up is our Capital Bank podcast. And today we have some really interesting stuff to talk about. Got some really great guests. And as you heard at the call at the outset, this is the USDA Solar Sunset call. So I got to thank Tim, who's our producer, for that wonderful alliteration, Solar Sunset. But what we are tackling today is a quiet crisis that's brewing in rural America. Basically, for years, the playbook for rural investors was simple: lease land to solar farms and collect what ostensibly was called mailbox money, and basically let the government subsidize and do the heavy lifting. But since an executive order that has come out earlier this year, this sort of era of easy money is ending, and some of the incentives that a lot of farmers and rural landowners, non-farm income, which we're going to learn a bit about later today, has been drying up. And it's leaving many wondering, like, what now? What now? And so, with a lot of the things that we talk about on Pick Up, we talk about the pivot. We talk about, hey, something is changing. There's a disruptive technology. There's a disruptive executive order. And what is the opportunity? And is the opportunity actually maybe potentially even bigger than what folks experience presently? So, but before we get into that, before we get into the solar sunset, I want to introduce our first two guests. So we have John Molinaro. He's the co-founder of Res Associates, and John has a fascinating background that we're going to talk a little bit about when we get into this. He actually started in the seminary before he worked in rural re-industrialization. And John, in your bio, there was something that you said that really struck me, that I thought was very powerful. You said, the best social welfare program is a good job. And I think that's really going to be kind of at the heart of what we talk about today when it comes to these rural reinvestment programs. But he spent the last 20 years in Western Minnesota, where he helped add 30,000 jobs and double regional wages. And he's basically been leading similar transformations in Appalachia, carrying over $6 billion of investment. So John, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And on the Capital Bank side, we have Riddick Skinner, who I also think has the coolest name in the world. I already told him that at the beginning of the podcast. He's our SVP of Government Guaranteed Lending and Capital Bank. And for Riddick, I think this is where there's a lot of overlap and kind of a lot of personal touches with this topic. I think that this isn't just business. This is in your blood. Like, I think what we're talking about today in terms of like rural investment. You grew up, or I guess you live in rural North Carolina, and your father worked for the Farmers Home Administration. Do I have that right? In the 70s?
He was a banker using the predecessor to the USDA B&I program, which was the Farmers. It was originally administered through the Farmers Home Administration in the late 70s when it first began. So
yeah.
So yeah, second generation banker.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really exciting for me about this topic is I think you guys both have really kind of like a personal relationship with the subject matter. And to me, that's the kind of thing that's where you see the real power. That's where you see the ability to make change. So I know I've kind of belabored the introductions a lot, and I kind of tease it at the outset of the call. But Riddick, why don't I start with you a little bit? So I think the catalyst for this conversation today is what we're calling the solar sunset, but it's basically the effectively ending the REAP program. Can you kind of just give us the 101 of like what was the REAP program? Why is it significant? And why are we even having this conversation today?
Yeah, no, thanks, JJ. Glad to be here today. Appreciate the time, and obviously glad to be chatting with John, who, again, unique perspective, and I think the two of us share a lot of the same philosophies on rural America and particularly energy. And so when we talk about the REAP program, that was a program in the USDA under the Rural Development Program, kind of a sister program to the Business Industry Program, which we'll talk more about later. And it was essentially what it stands for: Rural Energy for America. So the idea was to um, create and help, I guess, support the generation of energy, renewable energy in particular in rural America, through guaranteed loan programs. And that program had been running, clipping along, really swimmingly for a number of years, the past 10 years or so, and a program that we, as a bank, have used historically to finance a lot of solar. Fast forward 2025, the current administration not so bullish on solar, or wind for that matter, and executive order comes out and functionally ends the ability to continue to finance solar in rural communities of the U.S. through the REAP program. And so here we are saying, okay, this was a big part of our business, and really supporting rural America with the addition of what is a valuable commodity and something that's needed in all forms of business, which is energy. What do we do now, and where should we go with this?
So, Riddick, when I hear USDA, I think cows and steaks. I don't think energy. I don't, but I'm just like, I'm a dumb consumer. So, I mean, maybe John, you can maybe help sort of educate us. Like, what is the USDA landscape, and like, how does that, why are we even talking about energy or manufacturing, or with regards to USDA?
Most folks don't realize that USDA is the largest civilian department in the U.S. government. It does all the payroll for the rest of the government. It administers programs. We might think of it as social welfare programs like the SNAP program, which most of us know as food stamps. And it's not just about farming, and hasn't been just about farming for almost 100 years. What it's really focused on is the economic viability of the places in America outside of our major metro cores. And so it has an incredibly large loan portfolio, one of the biggest in the world, actually, where it's lent to farmers, yes, but it's lent to businesses, it's lent to energy projects, it's lent to various kinds of development projects. It also has some pretty substantial grant programs that help rural communities that don't have the resources to remain viable address critical things like water and sewer problems. It's a very, very important entity for the people who live outside of our core cities in America.
So, dimensionalize it for us a little bit, because I think, again, we're trying to bust this myth of like, hey, it's cows and plows. Like, I know that a lot of your work, John, has been about bringing business opportunities to rural America. So talk to us about how this program is typically deployed, and like what you've seen in your experience.
Well, with the USDA programs, virtually every county in America has a USDA staff presence. And through the Farmers Home Administration, the Farm Bank, I mean, there's an infrastructure that gets into the communities across America. And so it is really at the point of it is the federal entity that's trying to keep rural America viable. And then there are a few other organizations that may be specific to particular small pieces of the puzzle or particular regions, like the Appalachian Regional Commission. But as far as scale goes, nothing begins to compare with what USDA does for rural America.
And I think we're going to get into that a little bit later. But so I think, as we've sort of set the table here, the catalyst for this conversation is this executive order that came down not that long ago. And one of the things that I think as we had our pre-production meeting, we both talked about how this this cutting of solar incentives is coming at a really, I will say, inopportune time. And I think the way that one of you described it was sort of a mismatch of timing. And I guess, Riddick, maybe you can you help sort of paint the picture? Like, why is there this mismatch? Like, what are the pressures or the things that are creating this this unfortunate timing from what you guys have said?
Yeah, I think that we're at a time where we have a lot of aging infrastructure, whether it be nat gas, coal power plants. When you look at the average age of a coal-fired power plant in the U.S., I believe off the top of my head, it's about 46 years with a useful life somewhere in the neighborhood of 47 to 48 years. So, um, with that, then you have that, with that being the average, it tells you some are operating beyond what would have been contemplated as the useful life, meaning it's more expensive to continue to operate these types of power facilities. Um, we have a shortage right now in availability of nat gas turbines to develop new nat gas plants, even though we have an abundance of natural gas in our country, which would be a really clean fuel to burn. So the ability to develop and build new nat gas plants is hampered at this time. And then you have which everybody knows, everybody's talking about it, is the growth of AI, data centers, and then cryptocurrency, right? Those are all putting pressure in addition to just normal power demand. So when you think about aging power infrastructure potentially needing to roll off the grid, you're talking about removing plants that produce and put electrons on the grid at a time where we have a substantial increase in need and demand for electrons on the grid. And the primary new generation over the last 2 years has been comprised mainly of solar and wind. So if we're going to stunt growth or shut down the growth of two of the most prominent adders of electrons to the grid at a time where we have increasingly strong demand and demand growth predicted to increase. I think is 50 to 70% over the next, say 15 years. That's a substantial demand for new power generation. And when we talk about inopportune, to shut down your two major drivers of new power at a time where you're experiencing your greatest growth, it comes to supply and demand, right? So we're going to have a shortage of supply, an increase in demand, and we know what the result of that is. Simple economics, which means that prices are going to have to go up because of that. So um, that to me is somewhat inopportune.
So John, beyond like the energy crunch, whatever you want to call it, like I know that a lot of these incentive programs were aimed at revitalizing rural communities or providing economic activity for rural communities. Um, so that's not happening. And additionally, if these power sources aren't coming to rural communities, like what can you help kind of paint the picture of like what are the first, second, kind of third order implications of these changes, and how is it impacting rural communities?
Well, it's interesting because rural communities were seeing a brighter future uh, prior to these cuts because of reshoring of companies that had gone offshore, chasing lower labor costs. When companies began going offshore 30, 40 years ago, it was because the cost of labor was half the cost of making something. Energy was about 10%, and that included the energy to get things to market and the raw materials to the factories. Today, those numbers are reversed. Across the globe, more than half the cost of making something is the energy to make it and the energy to get it to market, and less than 10% is labor, especially in the larger manufacturing operations and the higher tech ones, which are where we're most competitive. So the one of the things America has had going for it, and I see us potentially losing that advantage, is that we've had the lowest energy costs of pretty much any fully industrialized country in the world. And so it became very, very competitive for companies, for CEOs trained in this era where you have to look at the total cost of a product rather than my generation, where you just looked at labor and tried to reduce that cost. It's become losing that energy price edge decreases the likelihood that those manufacturing jobs are going to end up back in America. If they do end up back in America, they're primarily going to end up in rural places. Metropolitan communities don't want heavy industry in their backyard for the most part. And so most of the siting of industry in America these days is happening outside of core metro areas.
So one of the things that I thought was really interesting, John, when we had our pre-production meeting, and we were talking about kind of all the different facets here, right? And the thing that did strike me is really interesting is that I had no idea that America had such a low cost of energy, and I think you had noted that China has one of the highest energy costs, yet that is where we consistently outsource a lot of our manufacturing to because there's a perception that it's cheaper. But I think what you're saying is like, hey, from an all-in cost perspective, it's actually not cheaper because the energy there is more, even though labor's cheaper, the energy is more expensive. Is that fair?
That's true, and their labor prices have been going up as more and more of their economy industrializes. Their wages are going up, and they're outsourcing the very labor-intensive work to places like Vietnam. So yes, if it's something that you can't take the human hands out of, it's not likely going to end up back in the United States and remain competitive. But for anything that involves technology, anything that is bulky and hard to ship, anything that is high tech, we really have been very competitive. And companies have been bringing those things back. They started bringing them back in at least by the 1990s. We were seeing that beginning to happen in rural Minnesota. And the trend has continued. Part of that is companies invested in other places. They saw their cost structure shift. They waited until they've amortized their investment and were ready to make a new one to bring things back. Unfortunately, we are de-emphasizing the most affordable source of new energy in America at a time when companies are wanting to come back to America because our energy prices are lower. It just doesn't make sense.
This is a pattern on some of the conversations on these podcasts where we're like, hey, there's this decision that has been made. It just doesn't make sense. But I think, that's what we're trying to do today is like, how do we make sense of it? Or like, how do we make sense of it for investors, or like what it actually means for folks? And I know that, Riddick, one of the things you had said is that you framed it a lot more eloquently than I, but you said that like power, or I guess solar farms don't use the roads. They don't take school buses, or something where you talked about like, hey, like the building these energy generation centers in our rural communities, it's just a net positive, right? Like it's all gain. And I guess, can you maybe just kind of tease that out for folks, because I obviously am not doing a good enough job of repeating what you had said.
Yeah, no, it's it doesn't put it. Solar farms don't put pressure on services that are offered in rural communities, right? What they do is they actually support and pay for those, because what they do is they pay large amounts of personal property tax to the municipalities that they operate in, which then adds to the tax base. And like, I think what you're saying is like they don't ride school buses, they're not on the roads, they don't use our hospitals. So you think about the core infrastructure in a rural community that might be pressured by increases in population or just use. A solar farm just kind of sits there. It pushes electrons onto the grid, and it pays a massive amount of property taxes to these rural communities and helps support those other things. So it does help support and generate money for school systems, for rural hospitals, and these communities. So while the power generation is intermittent, which I think is one of the the big kind of knocks against solar and maybe wind, is just the intermittency of the power, which is true. It does provide resiliency and support, and it is pushing electrons onto the grid that can be rerouted and allows for less use in some of the other maybe more expensive generation type technologies when it is producing. So
It also tends to be more distributed, which means that you don't have to do as much upgrading of the major transmission corridors in order to bring it online as you do when you bring on, say, a giant coal-fired plant, or if you were to bring on a new nuclear plant. The amount of infrastructure that it takes to support getting that concentrated amount of energy out is much greater than it does to have smaller energy sources spread around the countryside. You don't have to worry as much about transmitting it for long distances to get it to markets.
Right, and it also sounds to me like, if one is offline, it's not detrimental to the entire region. If you have sort of smaller, it's like that's like the thesis behind the internet, right? You always have, connectivity because you have kind of an unbreakable chain of networks, and that sounds to me like a little bit like what the thinking was in developing these energy networks. Is that fair, John?
That is fair. And that's also a strategy that the natural gas producers are trying to use. Gas is pretty easy to move around with pipelines, and so they've been going with smaller scale plants in more locations because it maximizes the efficiency of the grid and reduces the need for massive investments in new giant transmission lines all over the landscape.
So, unfortunately, it sounds like this is maybe not going to get the attention from the government that we're hoping for the time being. But like change is the only constant. I like to think about that, and so in the interim, I know that the administration and investors and business owners are looking to the other opportunities within the USDA program to leverage government incentives. And I think that the thing that came up in our conversations was, really seriously looking at, reshoring manufacturing, bringing manufacturing to rural America. And if I'm just kind of like a dumb news observer, headline watcher, I'm like, that's not a real thing. That's just like something that it's a pipe dream that people say. But like, I think, John, it is a very real thing, and I would love for you to maybe kind of touch on your background a little bit and get into like, tell us about the very real thing that is actually rural reindustrialization, and that how manufacturing is possible in America.
Sure. I'll tell you a story of west central Minnesota. It's an area that borders Fargo, North Dakota, and also northeastern South Dakota. Um, it's an area about the size of New Jersey, has about 200,000 people living in it. And I began working on revitalization of the economy there in the 1980s, following the major farm crisis that had farmers going under and towns shutting off the lights and disappearing off the map. Um, in doing that work, we looked at where does wealth come from? And it really comes from it traditionally has come from three places: extraction, digging a hole in the ground and removing minerals or removing natural gas or oil, um, uh, taking down forests is a, sort of a cross between extraction and agriculture, which is the second thing that generates wealth historically. And the third is manufacturing. You take raw materials and they make them into something with more value. Today, some economists might add to that and say the very cutting edge of software development that finds new and more and better ways of working with data might also create wealth. But everything else pretty much moves it around. So we have this region. We had a farm crisis going on, so we weren't going to rebuild the economy with that until that ended. We didn't really have much to extract, so we focused on manufacturing and said, what can we do in that area? And it was amazing how much we could do because the entrepreneurial spirit has never died in rural America. There's a tremendous amount of stuff that going on in small workshops and garages and barns and small factories all across America. And we asked people, what's keeping you from being able to do better? hire more people? And the answers were, first, access to capital. The banking system isn't serving us anymore. Second, we need to understand the technologies that are available to us and how to apply them, because we don't necessarily have a good source of information about that. And third, we need to make some investments in our current workers so that they can use those new technologies. So we focused on those three things beginning in 1986. And by the time that I left for another position in 2006, we had seen phenomenal progress on those things. We had more than doubled manufacturing employment in our region when it had gone down 30% across the U.S. We had increased the average wage in the region, doubled that as well, when it had gone down about 10 to 15% in most of the country in real inflation adjusted terms. And those manufacturing jobs brought new money into the community. That new money circulated, created new jobs in the community. And all told, adding about 6,000 manufacturing jobs meant the overall level of employment in our region went up by about 30,000 people in a region with 200,000 people living in it. So it was a huge win. We went from being 11th to 6th in Minnesota in terms of average weekly wage in our region, and the story goes on. But the big thing for people who live there is the kids started coming home. The parental wisdom had been, find a skill that will take you someplace else and get out of here because there's no opportunity for you here. Well, when the opportunities started arising, our decades of population decline turned around and the region started growing again. Added about 15,000 people over that period of time when it was expected to lose another 10,000. So you can do this stuff. And those companies were basically bringing opportunities back to America. They were at the very, very beginning end of the reshoring movement that we've been seeing picking up steam since those early inroads in the 90s.
And Riddick, so, John, well, thank you so much, because I think that really helps kind of paint the picture of like what this, you were very much kind of at the forefront of this movement, as far as having the return to manufacturing. Riddick, I think, as we mentioned at the outset of the conversation, you live out in rural North Carolina. I know that you've really specialized in taking advantage of this program. One of the things that I think was noted when we first spoke about this was this idea of like rural development hubs. Like, is what John has sort of helped kind of pioneer, in the 80s, what are we seeing? How is this evolving today? Like, what are you seeing kind of, especially on the lending side of things?
Well, I think when you find groups in areas, especially rural areas that, and we talked about this, I think, previously, is that some areas have great support and great ability to do the types of things that John and his team were able to do, and other areas don't. And so it's a little bit hit or miss. And I think, those are kind of the struggles we see in rural America still, having, grown up in it. A lot of the things John talks about resonate with me because I saw it firsthand, and left rural North Carolina because of, again, what was I going to do? What were the jobs? What were the opportunities going to be? And so when you find areas that are good at it, and we work with various economic development groups and markets where they do a great job marketing, they offer good incentives. You combine that with some of the USDA guaranteed loan programs, the grants, et cetera. Those are the types of things that's when you see the public-private partnership really coming together to promote the redevelopment of these rural areas. And I think that I'd love to say they were all as good as John and his team. They're not. We're aware of that, but we target the ones that are. And in areas where they're not, it's a little bit harder for us. But people still find their way. And I think that when we talk about underutilized programs, a lot of the USDA programs there's not a lot of great marketing around them. They're small in comparison to the SBA. The SBA is $35 to $40 billion a year. The USDA B&I program's under $2 billion. But it's still impactful. You combine that with the grants, some of the other incentives that are available. The idea of reshoring and bringing manufacturing jobs back to rural America, it's a real thing and it's possible. All the pieces are there to get it done. It's just going to take some awareness and just like everything, a little bit of hard work. So
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to want to do momentarily is I want to get into like, the types of businesses that we're talking about, because I think, when I like to paint pictures in my mind, right? I think manufacturing, like big factories, smokestacks, whatever, maybe it's like the, early 20th century notion of industrial. But I think, some of the businesses that we're going to touch on, maybe not quite what people would think. But I think before we get there, I know that, Riddick, you had the thing you just said was interesting. Like, hey, some of these areas, some of these regions work, others don't, and it seems like there is kind of a secret sauce to like what makes like I think we called it a rural development hub kind of work. There was a few different components. Like, I don't know, John, Riddick, do you want to kind of talk about that a little bit? It's like what's the magic kind of formula to make one of these rural development hubs work?
Well, there are several essential pieces. One is you need some entrepreneurial leaders, people who are willing to take a chance, people who are willing to step out and try some new things. Often that needs, in a rural place, needs to be a collective leadership model where you've got a group of people working together, taking leadership, rather than one person taking all the credit and all the blame. Works better in rural places. There needs to be some core element that provides some stability to the organization. It could be that they administer a federal program in an area, so that gives them enough of a base that they don't have to start from scratch to add a program or a service. And then it takes just a lot of hard work and trust. You need to get out to people, show them what's possible. You don't necessarily have to be able to provide everything, especially when it comes to financing. If you can work with a program that will allow you to take a slightly riskier place in the capital stack, then you can, for a project, if you can assume some of that risk, then the private lenders can come in and do the rest. We did that in West Central Minnesota on a day-to-day basis. We would be 10, 20, 30% of a project. That allowed a bank to come in and meet their underwriting standards, and a small company would expand. And they'd add 2, 3, 5 workers, and that would give them a base to expand again and add 10, 20 workers. And so it's incremental work as well.
So, Riddick, I want to talk about as we get let's get into some of these businesses, because I think this is where it starts to get kind of exciting and you start to see how these communities can start coming back. You had mentioned a project that you were familiar with in Danville, Virginia, and I think that was for a number of reasons this is a very interesting project. So maybe I'll let you kind of share and talk about it. Maybe John, if you want to jump in and provide any insights at all. But I think it's a good case study for us to kind of look at what a successful project looks like.
Well, it's a market that we've talked about a lot, and it's an interesting market because of some of the dynamics. But I think when you talk about areas that have a really successful public-private partnership, Danville's been a great example of that. Is a lot of manufacturing there, and in some cases significant manufacturing, maybe well beyond the type of investment or financing we could provide, with a USDA loan. And we're talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment in large manufacturing facilities. But the ability for an economic development team to, or kind of the economic development hub group to attract a business like that, is what we're seeing is not necessarily that first tier manufacturer, but the related businesses and kind of, I guess, the offshoot that you get from bringing a large business like that into
So
a market.
what was I don't know if we talked. What
Yeah.
was the business again? Just so everyone
It
kind
was
of
actually, yeah, that one was actually a hotel, but there's a battery manufacturing plant
right.
coming there, as well as some other really large manufacturing facilities in that market. And so it just creates a lot of demand for other businesses. And I think, when John was talking earlier, he was kind of referencing the things that are necessary to really build wealth. And you think about the impact of, okay, well, now you've got these jobs, these people are earning money. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to go shop at the grocery store. They're going to go to, Target or Walmart. They're going to buy houses. They're going to go to Lowe's or Home Depot. Oh, and then, there's probably people coming in from out of town. They need somewhere to stay. They need a hotel. They're going to go out and eat business dinner. It becomes endless when you start thinking about, the impact that one large, manufacturing facility can have in a rural area. It's not just the direct jobs, it's the indirect jobs that get created. And that's typically a pretty significant impact in rural communities.
And it doesn't really have to be a massive company. I mean, when you think of the major products that you might buy, most of the time the company that's name is on the product owns the engineering, they own the quality control, they may own a few critical components, but beyond that, they source out to smaller shops. And there are smaller shops like that all across rural America. So in west central Minnesota, we had a company that made the parts for the transmissions that went into one of the major manufacturers of motorcycles, snowmobiles, and so forth. And so those jobs tend to pay well. So we're not in the days where somebody like GM makes everything from the bolts that hold the wheels on the car to the engines to the body to the frame. They make strategic parts of that, not the whole product. And that creates a tremendous amount of room for entrepreneurship and smaller companies that don't need $100 million investments.
Well, and I think, John, something you had said when we spoke was that for a lot of these smaller manufacturers, like, they're making the things inside the things that people buy. Like, they might not be manufacturing the toaster, but they're making all the components that go into the toaster. And so whether we know it or not, we're actually buying a lot of rural manufacturing. Is that fair?
Absolutely. So one of the companies I work with made wiring harnesses. And there are hundreds of companies around the country and around the world that were buying their product. They were making exactly what the customer might need in order to route power and computer signals around various devices that they were making. And they were making it just in time. And there's a big difference between just in time in America and just in time in Asia. Just in time in Asia includes, 3 months on a boat to get it here. Just in time in America means you produce it this week and it's going into a product next week. There's a huge, huge cost savings in that. Not having to own all that inventory in the pipeline. And that again makes America very competitive for a company that knows how to use modern technologies and in order to get their products made.
Well, and also, that's the kind of thing, having access to those goods quickly and not having to hold all that inventory, that's the kind of thing that spurs entrepreneurism, right? Because then you can afford to be capital light. You can start a business. You can continue to grow your business. If you had, if you're waiting 3 months for those components to come around, that's like, it's a whole quarter. Like, and if you're a small business, you don't have time to wait a quarter for something like that. You need it now.
Well, if you were reading the news reports about supply chain disruptions with COVID, one of the big issues was that it was hard enough to get things made and get them to you, but when you had to get them made and get them to you for halfway around the world during a pandemic, it got companies fundamentally rethinking where they were going to make stuff.
So, you know, as we get on the topic of like making stuff, and I think this kind of ties into sort of what Riddick was talking about in terms of these, the network effect of or multiplier effect of these communities growing. I think that there's a looming question of, and I think as you think about like labor and you talk about the jobs report and unemployment numbers and you know where are all the people, or I think what you said is that there's a hidden workforce that, or what we've discovered is with rural manufacturing, that there's people there that maybe we hadn't accounted for, or like that don't get counted when we think about like labor.
In the 35 Appalachian counties of Ohio, people don't think of there being 35 Appalachian counties of Ohio, but there are very rural places. 1 out of every 4 working adults drives into a metro area, typically more than an hour in each direction every day. So you add 2 hours of travel time plus what's that, maybe 6 or 8 gallons of gas, depending on your vehicle. And you have basically a labor force that is willing to come home and be quite affordable to a company because they're not spending the money out of pocket and they're ahead, taking a little less for something in their community versus driving an hour or more to have a job that pays a decent wage when they've got to go into a metro area to do that. So there's a lot of workforce in rural America that is undercounted. And we've been able to capitalize that here in West Central and Southeastern Ohio.
And I think the flip side of that is, Riddick, one of the things you had mentioned about, especially in Danville with I think you mentioned there was a hotel that there was so much demand because there was so much job creation that was created with this battery factory. There was so much demand that these hotel prices started to rival like city prices. Is that what you had mentioned?
Yeah, we're being told that in some cases you can't find a hotel room in Danville, and when you do, they're $400 a night. I mean, those are prices above, what I paid in DC last week or what I paid in, New York City 2 months ago, right? So I mean that, $400 a night in Danville, I mean, it's mind-boggling. Just lack of available rooms, which again just shows you that the impact that a good economic development hub can have in bringing quality jobs and what that impact has on a small rural community.
And Danville's also invested pretty heavily in workforce training as well, which creates a virtuous cycle. If you have the workers with the right skills, then companies are more likely to come, which means you need more workers with those skills. And it cycles up and people's lives get better, their wages get better. Companies pay for the abilities of the people that they're hiring.
So let's pretend I'm a business owner, or I'm a CEO of a company that, let's say I do all my manufacturing happens overseas, right? And I'm looking at tariffs and I'm looking at energy costs and I'm looking at all the things that are happening in America, and I'm like, maybe onshoring is the right path for me. Maybe this is maybe maybe it's doable. I've fired up Excel, the mass, according to John. But like, what do I need to be thinking about? Like, what should I be? What's the first step I should take if I'm really like seriously considering, onshoring my business? And John, Riddick, I would throw this out to the both of you. Like, how should a business owner sort of think about this opportunity?
One of the key things about thinking about the opportunity is a question of where makes sense for what you're doing. So, yeah, the biggest savings are going to be found where you're either close to your markets or you're close to your source of supply. Well, being in America can make you a lot closer to your markets. So one of the things that's Southeast Ohio has going is that you can reach more than half of the American population in a truck driving shift. Um, but you might have a raw material that goes into your product. Where is that made? So there's a question of do you focus on where your markets are? Do you focus on where your materials are? Or if you can find a confluence of the two, that's certainly an ideal place to start in making a location decision. And frankly, I think when you begin looking at those things in America, for a lot of manufacturing goods, America makes sense, and rural America, if you're going to be in America, is really the place to be.
Riddick, so coming at it from maybe the funding perspective, if I'm, obviously starting a factory, relocating, whatever, it's a big capital investment, what are some of the ways that um or what should we be thinking about, if we're thinking about taking this step?
Well, I think that, obviously the things John hit on are probably the most important. And at the point at which somebody determines, hey, this location is viable for these reasons, I think then you're then going to probably the county and the state to identify what type of maybe incentives are available there. And I think in a lot of states and counties, especially rural areas, there are readily available incentives for people to bring jobs and employment to these communities. And so seeking those out really adds additional financial benefit to what, somebody has already identified as a profitable business model based on location for product, accessibility to, or the support to get necessary training for a skilled workforce to handle whatever business you're going to run, and then obviously location and ability to ship. Like John said, Ohio, areas of Pennsylvania, I think are pretty unique in that they have it, the number of I guess trucking routes that come in and out of those is kind of cool when you look at it, and the ability to get to access large portions of the continental U.S. from a central point. You do all that, then you're potentially looking at, okay, what are the financing options that are available, and that's where we always try to come in and use the BNI program. Is okay, we can potentially, because of the support from the USDA, maybe we're able to bring into the mix availability or the knowledge of some grant programs that may be available through the USDA. In addition to that, we're talking about potentially higher leverage and longer terms that are more flexible for borrowers. And that you combine all those things together, and um, you know what are new businesses looking at? What's one of the biggest constraints is cash, right? So how do we limit that? Well, we try to offer longer terms and higher leverage to allow for more flexibility from that regard, where maybe they're not having to go out and give away half their business to private equity. Owners can retain their businesses, retain more of it, and I think that's really the key for us.
I love it. So John, I want to end with you, and I want to kind of go back to, I want to go back to the beginning. I want to go back to your roots a little bit, because I think we could do a whole podcast on you. That's just kind of your story and your background. I think it's a fascinating background. But you left the seminary like 40 years ago. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
changed because you felt called to do this work, which is building and revitalizing communities. And you'd mentioned something earlier, and you kind of just said it in passing, but I wanted to come back to it. That you said that that despite everything, like all the change, the offshoring and shifting political climates and all that, like the entrepreneurial spirit has never left rural America. And to me, that's such a touching and meaningful statement. And I'd love for you just to kind of like, what does that mean to you, and how do you identify that? Because I think it's so core to, I think, the why that I think both of you got, like what we're talking about here. I'd love to just hear in your words kind of like what that means.
In rural America, there are so many people who love their place. And if you don't have some massive employer in the place, um, sometimes your option is to make your own job. And making your own job is is a major industry in rural America. And it happens in so many different ways. It could be opening a little cafe on Main Street in a town that maybe doesn't have a fast food um, franchise, or maybe it does have one and somebody's looking for a home cooked meal. It could be your local opening a car repair place. It can be um, uh, the list goes on. I mean, you can't in rural America, you can't count on there being some big business entity that's going to fill all the gaps. I mean, you may not be able to go to your major home supply store and get them to outsource installing a new kitchen because there isn't the major home supply store that does that in your area. There's somebody who's a craftsperson who does your kitchen. Um, it's amazing how many businesses come out of farm workshops. In order to keep a farm going in America, you have to know how to weld, you have to know how to repair. People see better ways of doing something, and that can turn into a business opportunity. One guy that we financed had a better way of making what they call a side draft indicator, which is something that they put on a tractor so that you know where your plow is behind you on the slope of the hill that you're plowing. That turned into a pretty big business for that person. The entrepreneurial spirit is alive, well, it's functioning every day in rural places. And that's despite the fact it is very, very hard to find conventional credit on reasonable terms in most of rural America.
John, thank you so much. So John, as we close, where can people find you?
Well, my organization, RES Associates, is our organization email address is RES stands for Rural Economic Success @gmail.com.
Simple.
So think of those 3 words, string them all together. I know it's long, but it's easy to remember.
I love it. I love it. And Riddick, where can people find you?
Pretty easy. R Skinner at capitalbankmd.com.
Awesome.
As in Maryland. Yeah.
As in yes, as in Maryland.
As in Maryland.
Well, John Molinaro, Riddick Skinner, thank you so much for having you here. And everyone, we'll see you next time on Pick Up. Thanks so much. Talk soon. Bye.